The Killing Sea, Chapter 9. Ruslan sprinted down to the seawall. In those few strides, he noticed that the body in the gray overalls had a thick neck and a bald head. It wasn't his father. Still, that didn't mean his father hadn't been trapped with the ship. Another sailor stood on the seawall. "My father," Ruslan asked him. "Where's my father? Yusuf the mechanic? He was working on the tanker." "They're all dead. All of them dead." The sailor strode away, chanting, "Dead, dead, dead." Ruslan squatted and wrapped his arms around his head as though that would stop his heart from ripping in half. His elbow rubbed against a lump in his shirt pocket. Something about the lump penetrated to his stricken mind. It was the letter from his father. He opened it as carefully as he could with his trembling fingers. The scribbled writing was still legible. "I'm not going to work on the tanker. I'm going to IMA. Your mother's relatives have asked me to come. I didn't want to tell you last night and worry you. You look like you haven't been getting enough sleep as it is. Don't worry about me. I should be home by evening. I'll let you know. Don't worry. I'll be fine." Any other day except this one, Ruslan would have indeed worried despite his father's underlining. The hill village of Imame was considered rebel territory, where rebels were fighting for an independent Aceh state. In fact, Ruslan had heard rumors that his mother's relatives were themselves rebels. Over the years, military intelligence officers had periodically summoned Ruslan's father for questioning. So, sure, any other day except this one, he would have been terribly worried. But on this day, with dead sailors floating around the oil tanker, the note filled him with such an overwhelming relief that he cried. He blubbered like a baby. When he finally dried his tears, he had only one thing in mind. He had to get to Imame. The shortest way was via Kalan, a sleepy harbor town 50 miles north of Malabo, and then a road into the hills. He made his way across the ruins of Ujung Quran to the main road heading north to Kalan. Thick sand covered the road. A battered minibus lay toppled on its side. Ruslan started to climb onto the bus for a better look, but then noticed a crush of bodies within. He climbed instead a remnant of wall. The bridge spanning the northern estuary had been ripped off its concrete base, its metal span flung to the side. There was a back way, an old logging trail. It began somewhere around the farming village of Bergan, 10 miles inland. First things first, then, he had to get to Bergan, and the surest way to do that was to start walking. The sea had flooded nearly all the way to the hospital. This inland part of town was untouched by water, but bubbled with chaos. People ran around in distress, dodging vehicles that seemed to be doing nothing but turning around in circles, their drivers uncertain where to go. In an alley, Ruslan spotted a trail bike gliding on side, keys still dangling in the ignition. It would be perfect for the logging road. He'd borrow it and return it later to its owner with apologies. There wasn't a helmet for him to wear, but sometimes in an emergency, one had to take chances. Nobody stopped him as he righted the bike and checked the fuel. Empty. Just down the block was an unattended kiosk that sold gasoline in glass bottles. He filled up the bike's tank and took 2 spare bottles, putting them in a canvas knapsack that had been resting on the counter. He'd pay the kiosk owner later. 10 minutes later, he was blasting down a smooth road winding through rice paddies. Their green serenity seemed to Ruslan to be another world. On the outskirts of Bergan, a farmer on the way to his fields gave directions to the logging road turnoff. "Be careful," he said. "Rebels are in that area." Ruslan found the turnoff an unpaved slash of orange dirt leading into a rubber plantation. 2 privates from the military's raider division were seated on a wooden guard hut at the foot of the small shrub-covered hill. On top of the hill stood a sand-bagged command post. As soon as the privates saw Ruslan, they lowered a bamboo gate across the trail. What was he going to say? He said the first thing that came to mind. "Malabo's been flooded out by sea. People are dead everywhere." One of the privates blew cigarette smoke. "What are you talking about?" "The town's destroyed. So many dead people." His voice quavered. The soldiers stared at him. "You're crazy," said the second private. "I'm not crazy. I tell you, the town's gone. Bodies everywhere, drowned, smashed up." "Let's see your ID card." Ruslan took out the laminated identity card from his damp wallet. The soldier studied it, compared Ruslan's face to the small photo, and said, "I think you better come talk to our commander." Ruslan parked the bike in a small lot behind the hill, hanging his backpack off the handlebars. He palmed the ignition key. One of the soldiers escorted him up the hill into a room with 2 bunk beds, a desk, and a radio set. An officer sat at the desk with a cell phone in his hand, punching buttons in irritation. Ruslan could hear the squeal of disrupted service. The officer cursed. The private handed the officer Ruslan's ID card. "There's been a flood in Malabo," Ruslan said. "Most of Malabo's gone, I tell you. Smashed to pieces by a giant ocean wave, so many dead." The officer was just as skeptical as the private. Is that so? Look at me. My shoes are wet, my jeans are wet. I nearly drowned. The officer grunted. His leathery face held the natural suspicion of all field officers. You rebels should learn to tell a better story. The officer's skepticism made Ruslan wonder if in fact he was somehow imagining it all. Yet specks of that awful black muck still dotted his forearms. I'm not a rebel, Ruslan said. I'm a good citizen. You can ask anybody. Don't worry. We will. The officer put Ruslan's ID card in his pocket. He got up and left the room, his last words a command to the private to keep an eye on Ruslan. The private ordered Ruslan to squat in the corner. Ruslan thought quickly. Once they found out he was the son of Yusuf the mechanic, who had possible rebel connections, military intelligence would interrogate him. They had ways to make one speak. And if they found out from him that Yusuf the mechanic was in rebel country, then who knew what trouble would come to Ruslan and his father? It was crazy to be thinking about such things when Malabo had flattened and thousands had drowned. Still, there it was. Ruslan made a wincing face. I have to go to the bathroom. Diarrhea. Out there, the private said, gesturing through an open door to the latrine with sandbagged perimeter. As Ruslan had hoped, the tin sheet wall of the latrine was not securely fixed onto the wooden frame. He worked one side open and squeezed through. After putting the ignition key in his mouth for quick access, he climbed over the sandbag embankment and skidded onto his rear down the hill's steep slope to the trail bike. Above him, he heard the private's cry of alarm. Ruslan felt surprisingly calm as he put on his backpack and swung onto the bike. He inserted the ignition key and thumbed the engine switch. The bike roared to life. He goosed it around in a tight circle, but he'd forgotten about the kickstand, which caught in the dirt. The bike wobbled, nearly throwing him. He wrestled the handlebars, losing precious seconds, but managed to get the bike under control. He flicked up the kickstand with his right heel as he opened the throttle, speeding out onto the trail. Behind him, he heard shouts and loud cracks of rifles. The ground to the side and in front of him exploded in a shower of dirt. They weren't shooting to warn him. Bending low to the handlebars, he raced into the rubber grove. Within a minute, he was lost in an unending ranks of trees. He braked to a stop to orient himself. Shouts in the distance. He sped off in the opposite direction. The ditch came up unseen, camouflaged by thick weeds. He flew off the handlebars and lay stunned on hard ground. Gasoline trickled down his neck, the scent of it making him woozier. A bottle in his pack had broken, but he took dazed inventory of his body parts. He himself seemed intact. He sat up and found himself looking down the length of a ragged, unpaved road, the hard-pan dirt creviced by the rain runoff. Here the rubber plantation gave way to the dense scrub trees that marked the logged forest, the scraggly trees bending over the road, almost making a tunnel. He'd found the old logging trail. The bike's electric thumb start was smashed. He cranked the kickstart. No luck. The faint growling of a jeep filtered through the trees. Another crank. Nothing. He bent over to the side and looked. The cap to the spark plug was loose. He crammed it on tight. This time, the bike started just as the hood of a jeep smashed through some weeds. Jamming the bike into gear, he roared off, zigzagging around crevices. He came to a washout too steep for any four-wheel vehicle to traverse. Almost too much for the bike as well, but he managed to tug and wrench it down and then back up the eroded contours. Another washout followed, and then a third. An hour later, his arms felt as though they were going to come off. His thigh muscles ached, his stomach hurt. Who would have thought riding a bike would be such hard work? He'd never done anything so physical in his life and so demanding of relentless concentration. His brain was about as wrung out as his muscles, only to cover 5 miles. But he was 5 miles closer to Imame. When dusk came, he'd been hours riding through boggy lowland. He drove the bike onto a spit of higher ground and got off. His arms and hands continued to vibrate. Squatting by a pool of stagnant water, he washed dirt off his face. That done, he lay down close to the bike, using his knapsack as a pillow. He'd forgotten about the broken bottle, though, and fished out the pieces. He found 2 tangerines. After washing and peeling them, he squatted by the trail bike and sucked the sections one by one. He chewed the pulp, spitting out the seeds, idly aiming for a lump of submerged moss the size of his head in the water. As he spat out the last seed, he noticed that the lump was making the slightest of ripples in the water. In fact, the lump was attached to what he'd taken for a twisted mossy log, which was itself rippling ever so gently. He noticed then the python's eyes focused intently on him.